Bum ba dum ba dum, it's story time. Bum ba dum bum bum, woo woo. Bum ba dum, it's story time. Bum ba dum, with Emily. Bum ba dum, with Emily.
Welcome back, campers and camp community. Today we're here for our second story time and also our last story time of the summer. So thank you so much for joining us. If you missed our first story time, go check out a couple weeks ago we posted our first story time, and this story today has kind of continues on from last week's story. So go check it out. Yes, and for today we will be reading, or I will be reading, Lancelot's Adventure, or Lancelot's Quest, and it is by Peggy Wright. And I'm also joined here by Emily and James, who will be action first. While Rapunzel was searching the forest for King's Love, a plant that would save the people from the Median virus, Lancelot was having his own adventures. Lancelot had stood by helplessly 5 years earlier as his father, the king, led people to safety during the Median attack. Lancelot was just past being a boy, but not yet a man, when the war raged around him. He saw his father surrounded, but was too far away to help. He yelled for the knights to rally and help the king. His voice completely drowned out in the confusion. His father disappeared from sight, and he was never seen again. That day, he made a vow to become the more powerful, stronger, louder, and faster. Lancelot started taking private lessons to make his own voice more commanding. He began doing 100 push-ups a day and launched a spy network to trace the movements of the enemy. He even trained a flock of geese to secretly communicate without raising suspicion. Only downside is that sometimes they pooped on you. He tried to avoid that. Loud noises and crowds bothered Lancelot, so the first thing he did was to clean up the streets. He canceled all the festivals and markets. Musicians drew crowds, so they were banned from performing on the streets. Children were a nuisance and distracted the knights from their duties, so they were ordered to stay away from the courtyard. Just when he felt like he had everything under control, Lancelot's best friend, Morty, ran into the room, shouting that the royal outhouse was on fire, and their friend Marjorie was last seen going inside. Lancelot jumped to his feet. That outhouse was his pride and joy, since it meant less chamber pots and stinkiness in the castle, and Marjorie could be in grave danger. Lancelot shouted,
Guards, mobilize the bucket brigade! Tower crier, blast the trumpet to gather the people. Get the church bells ringing! Emergency!
Once the room cleared, Lancelot took a moment to check himself in the mirror. He practiced the look, slicking back his hair, giving a wink, and strode with a knightly air from the room, a kingly air from the room. By the time Lancelot reached the area, his commands were being carried out. The buckets were being sent down a line of townsfolk to put out the flames. The outhouse was very large. Lancelot had ordered a statue of himself built in front of the entrance for all to see, but the work there had delayed the water being brought in to make the baths functional. Now it was tragic that the water was so far away. The water had been passed by bucket from well, which was down the path, over the bridge, through the gate, and across the courtyard. They needed all the people to work together. When Lancelot arrived, he started strutting up and down the line, criticizing the speed and technique of those he considered beneath him. He yelled,
You're spilling it! Move faster!
He didn't think to stop and help himself. One brave beggar wrapped a wet towel around himself and ran into the building to bring Marjorie out safely. But just as he entered the building, a section of the roof supporting Lancelot's charred face fell inward. The crowd gasped. Morty yelled,
Marjorie!
Lancelot stepped back in horror. The quilt maker drew quilts in the water trough and showed the guards how to hold them up to create a tunnel of temporary protection as the beggar and Marjorie ran through to safety. Soon the fire was out. Lancelot snapped to attention and yelled out,
"How was this fire started? Who is to blame for this tragedy?"
Leaving Marjorie in the care of the quilt maker, Lancelot and Morty rode off with a small team behind them to find who was starting the fire and arrest them. Soon the group entered a densely wooded forest where a heavy mist lay. They could barely see where they were going. Some of them were walking into trees. The group grew confused and began to scatter. Before long, Lancelot found himself alone on the edge of a swamp. P.U. It stank. Darkness was descending, so he dismounted and tied his horse loosely to a nearby bush. After a quick meal, Lancelot rested his head on his bag and fell into an exhausted sleep. While he slept, he dreamed. He dreamed of the kingdom full of light and beauty, music and compassion for all people. In the middle of the crowds stood the king. He radiated goodness. Lancelot started to run to the king, but the king seemed to be moving farther and farther out of reach as he held up a banner that said, "Man looks at outward appearance, but God looks at the heart." The king spoke to his son.
"Lancelot, never forget who you are. My heart beats in you. Remember, remember."
Lancelot jolted awake as the sun was rising. He heard a snarl from just above his head. A wolf was crouched and ready to pounce on him. His sword was beyond his reach. Lancelot crawled back slowly from the wolf and suddenly dropped into a deep pit, heard a crack beneath him. Ouch! A clatter of pots and pans and the tuneless whistle of a tin seller drove the wolf away. Then a dirty face peered over the top of the pit. The tinker called down.
"Sir, are you hurt?"
Lancelot was bruised and stiff, but it was his leg that worried him.
Oh, goodness. I think I broke my leg. There's no way I can climb.
The tinker ringed up a sling at the bottom of the rope and dropped it down into the gully to Lancelot. He tied the end of the rope to his horse and gently moved forward until Lancelot's head was above the edge of the hole. Then he gently lifted Lancelot to the side of the hole, looking for a bandage. Lancelot cried out in pain and fainted as the tinker splinted his leg. The tinker placed Lancelot on a blanket inside the wagon, tied Lancelot's horse to the back of the wagon, and made his way to the edge of the woods. Morty was on his horse, surrounded by guards, when he saw the wagon approaching. He yelled out for the tinker to give back Lancelot's horse.
"How dare you take a horse from the son of the king? What have you done with Lancelot?"
The tinker bowed to the men and said politely,
"I pulled him from a hole and bound his broken leg. He is here."
Morty took charge.
"How did this happen? Men, untie Lancelot's horse. You there, Tinker Man, I order you to follow us to the castle with your wagon. But you cannot bring your silly collection of tins into our streets. It's against the law to make such a racket."
"Yes, sir."
The tinker said as he climbed down from his wagon and began to remove his noisy metal scraps he used to mend pots and metal objects. Morty asserted,
"Quickly now, men, help him, move faster."
Lancelot was just regaining consciousness when he heard Morty command the men to
"Drop those racks over there. I might put you in the dungeon when we get back to the castle for being dirty and ruining this fine day."
Lancelot sat up and asked Mortimer what he thought he was doing. Morty spluttered out that he was only following the law to the letter. He was keeping the dirty tinker and his noise out of the town and away from the decent folk of the castle. Lancelot hung his head when he heard these words. He was sure his father wouldn't be pleased with the rules he had made that had led to such harsh judgment on those who didn't deserve them. Lancelot said quietly,
"The tinker's kindness saved me. Let him keep his medal, for it is his livelihood. His wagon can get me to the gate where you can order another to meet us. Then we can satisfy the law and my conscience. Please, get me something to cover my ears, or I may faint again."
Lancelot recalled the words of his dream to remember who who he was as the son of the king. He was raised watching the king look beyond outward appearance to measure the goodness in a person's heart. He knew the tinker was a good man, and Lancelot would do his best to ensure that he and others like him found safety and refuge in the kingdom that his father had made. The end. Thank you so much for joining us for Storytime this week. Not next week, but the week after that will be our last campfire and our last evening event of the summer. Thank you so much if you've been following along, and we hope to see you on the evening event in the comments soon.
Bum ba dum ba dum, it's story time. Bum ba dum ba dum bum bum.